So today I'm going to talk about the effects of the cannabis and how it regulates something in the body called the endocannabinoid system, and what are some of the different effects that cannabis and the different compounds can actually have upon your physiology. So you may not be familiar that all of you actually have compounds that are literally cannabinoids in your body right now. They work through a system called the endocannabinoid system. And this, again, is internal to your own body. It was officially, quote unquote, discovered in 1988, which really isn't that long ago when you think about it, that just a few decades ago, we discovered literally an entire system in your body and how it's working to regulate different systems. So you might be familiar with something called the runner's high. So in the past, we didn't really know exactly what that was associated to. And it's discovered that the runner's high is actually associated to the endocannabinoid system. So when you're doing exercise or high levels of exertion, especially for a longer period of time, your body does put out one of these compounds called anandamide. So anandamide is your body's own intrinsic cannabinoid. There's two main intrinsic ones. So anandamide is the first one, which is from Sanskrit, which means bliss molecule. And the second one is another compound called 2-AG. So the names are not necessarily super important. The takeaway is that your body does have its own endogenous production of cannabinoids itself. So if we skip ahead a little bit and we talk about how cannabis itself originated and some of the background, some of the history on it, then we'll go back and we'll connect how the cannabis is actually interacting in the human body. So cannabis was first, again, quote, discovered around probably 12 to 15,000 years ago. The exact timeline is up for debate. Probably originally started in Central Asia. But if you look through history, they found, different compounds related to the cannabis plant used for all sorts of things. They've been found in many different cultures. So Michael Pollan has kind of best described the cannabis plant as something that sort of evolved or coexisted with humans. I think it was Michael Pollan who also said that the cannabis plant is kind of like what dogs are to humans. It has many different forms. And if you think about dogs, like we can all recognize a dog, but you've got, your Great Danes to your little corgis. You've got just a huge range of dogs that have kind of co-evolved to be with humans. He equates that the cannabis plant has done something similar. There are various different types of cannabis plants, but they all can have different outputs, different compounds, and we'll get into what those actual compounds are. If we were to divide up the three main types of the cannabis plant, just to use common terms, you've probably heard of these before. So one type would be the sativa type. The second type would be the indica type or variety. And the third is one you may not have heard of, called a ruderalis. This is primarily used for hemp production. They also contain high amounts of CBD. Because the ruderalis plant isn't really have any THC, which is the active, more psycho component in cannabis, it doesn't really get talked about a whole lot. I'm sure you've heard of things about sativa and indica. So the common folklore is that the indica type plants will more kind of bring you down or calm you. Sativa plants tend to be more uplifting. If you look at the actual research on that, though, however, trying to distinguish a sativa plant from an indica plant based on chemical analysis is very difficult. The reason for that is all of the plants have been sort of hybridized for thousands upon thousands of years. So if you were to take a chemical component of one of the plants and you run it through a lab, do some fancy equipment, you would have to then compare it to a known, say, 100% version of a sativa plant. And we don't really have any of those 100% sativa or 100% indicas to compare it to. So you may hear things of, this is 57% sativa or different percentages. And the hard part is we can't really establish any percentages because we don't have a pure 100% person, or I should say compound, to then compare it to. So everything right now is some form of a hybrid. Yes, you may have some versions that are more sativa, and you may have some more versions that are indica. If you look at pictures of the plants themselves, they do look quite different. So the indica type plants have a different leaf structure, and they tend to be kind of shorter, more squatty, kind of more bunched together. If you look at plants that tend to be more on the sativa side, they do tend to grow much taller, they tend to be more spread out, and just their structure looks different. So some of the common folklore of where the indica plants kind of bring you down more is theorized to be from that the plants exist closer to the ground and that the sativa plants grow taller, therefore they appear to be more uplifting. Now, there isn't really a whole lot of truth to that, but there are some other subcomponents in each one of these plants that do have different effects. So there may be some truth to that, although it's generally pretty much kind of overblown. And in certain places like in Amsterdam and other countries, they're trying to go away from that and to actually look at what are the actual physical components and chemicals in it, and then do more of a complete analysis based on that. And we'll get into what are some of the other components there too. The two main ones I'm sure you've heard of is THC. So the active component in most cannabis, the technical formal name is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. There is also slightly different versions of delta-8 and delta-10, but delta-9 is going to be the main one. The other version I'm sure you've heard of is cannabidiol or CBD. So in terms of the components of cannabis, those two are going to be by far the biggest components. THC is the main psychoactive component in cannabis. There may be some other components that are psychoactive, but only in high amounts, and generally probably not so much. So THC is the main psychoactive component. So CBD was actually first isolated before THC. It was first isolated or discovered in 1940, and it was kind of promptly discarded because it didn't have any psychoactive effects. At the time, they were trying to figure out why does cannabis have psychoactive effects, so CBD was kind of sort of discarded. THC was first isolated in 1964, and that was a pretty big discovery because that gave us sort of hints as to how the endocannabinoid system is actually working and different components of it. Even though, like I said at the beginning, endocannabinoid system wasn't officially discovered until 1988. There are many other different components in cannabis also. These are a subclassification called cannabinoids. Right now, there's been well over 100 different cannabinoids that have been discovered. Odds are we're probably going to discover even more after that. You've heard of THC, CBD. You might have heard of CBN, which might be useful for sleep, CBG, and there's a whole laundry list of these other components. And I think in the future, we'll be seeing a lot more of these different cannabinoids and trying to classify cannabis as to having these different percentages of them to give us a little bit better idea of what is the actual effects from them. If we back up and look at how do they interact in the body, there's generally two main receptors. It gets to be a little bit more complicated and mucky than that, but you have your CB1 receptor, creatively named cannabinoid receptor 1. And you have, shocker, CB2, because scientists sometimes aren't very creative, cannabinoid receptor 2. And while it's a general overalization, CB1 receptors tend to be more in the central nervous system and the brain. Although as research has been emerging, we do find them on many other tissues in the body also. CB2 primarily tends to be a little bit more in the body. So CB2 you'll find on blood cells, you'll find them even in connective tissue, spleen, and other organs like that. CB1 will be primary effects are looking at appetite, fear, and more things that are modified via the nervous system itself. Although we have found them on other tissues for fat tissue, muscle, metabolic rates. So we have found them in other locations also. It's commonly assumed that THC does primarily hit the CB1 receptor, which is true, although it may have other effects elsewhere in the body too. And that's why it does have the kind of psychoactive effects. It is interacting with the CB1 receptor, primarily in the nervous system itself. So THC, primarily a CB1 receptor, and then primarily more in brain or nervous system effects. Again, these are kind of wide generalizations, but they're helpful to kind of categorize it and to give you a framework of it. CB2 receptors, one of the primary ones there is going to be CBD, and this is more generally kind of different body effects. Although we do know that CBD does appear to cross the blood-brain barrier, may have actually some neuroprotective effects and reduce neuroinflammation and has other effects there too. So these compounds do go across many, many different systems in the body in and of themselves. One of the questions that comes up then is if you just have THC itself, or you've heard probably consuming CBD with THC may modify some of the effects. People who have kind of more of a fearful or get more anxiety sometimes at high levels of THC, there is some data that CBD may modify some of those effects. Research on that is still a little bit split. But one of the famous quotes was, you can imagine that THC and CBD are like an old married couple that tend to argue, but they do their best when they're both together. How this works is that each one of these, like I said, is going to interact with a receptor. So THC will primarily interact with the CB1 receptor. You probably remember back to your biology, where it's sort of like a lock and key. The THC will enter the receptor, and then it will kick off a bunch of downstream activation from there. When you add CBD to the mix also, what happens is the CBD can kind of interact with the THC, and it doesn't have as much affinity for the receptor in and of itself. So I kind of imagine it that if you have a nightclub, and you want to get into the nightclub to have some effect, to have fun, THC will kind of go straight through, gets into the nightclub, hits the receptor, you're all good. When you have CBD that comes along, now imagine you both get sort of stuck at the door and you're kind of arguing with each other to see kind of who gets through. You have this kind of interference effect. So when you add CBD into the mix with THC, they can have slightly different effects with each other, and they also may modify it. Now again, when you're adding CBD into the equation also, you have the effects that CBD is going to have on the body, in addition to potential of this kind of competition between THC and CBD. If we back up and then look at some of the other components in cannabis, we said we have cannabinoids, which there are over 100 that have been identified so far. The main two are THC and CBD. But we can have other compounds called terpenes. So if you've ever smelled cannabis, it can have widely different smells from, oh, smells like diesel, smells like a really bad skunk, kind of lemony, oh. Those flavors are the actual terpene components themselves. And these are much less component, but new research is showing that they also appear to be quite active in their physiologic effects. Some of the new profiles that you look at on cannabis now have something called a chemovar profile. And this is trying to take into account not only the THC amount, the CBD amount, maybe there's other cannabinoids that are present, also taking into account the terpenes and how they may interact with it. So this is an attempt to try to get at what would be sort of the final effect of all of these things sort of combined themselves. This has been referred to as the entourage effect, which is from Rousseau, that these components add up to an effect that might be a little bit more than if they were just singled out. Again, research on that is generally split, but they do appear to have an effect overall. If we look at some specific terpenes real quick, one of the ones is myrcene, and this is a compound that's primarily associated with what they would call couch lock, right? If you ever feel like you just kind of got stuck on your couch and you don't know why, look at the cannabis and see if that terpene is high in there. It appears that that one can have those effects. What happens is it's modifying one of the receptors in the body. It's called a TRVP1 or vanillinoid-1 receptor. And when you ingest it, it'll have different effects in the body, and it can kind of change the muscle activation temporarily, can make you feel a little bit kind of freaked out. Interesting enough, this receptor, when it's on your tongue, this is the same receptor that'll pick up capsaicin. So if you've had really, really hot sauce and you feel like you're burning your tongue, that is a TVPR1 receptor that's having that effect. Just happens to be located on the tongue and is having a specific local interaction there. So again, these receptors and these effects are widespread throughout the body. And the pharmaceutical companies have been trying to isolate these by creating purified cannabinoids in the lab. So they're trying to go, if we only want this one effect, can we create an isolated pure compound? And that would then be a new drug or a new pharmaceutical. So far to date, it's been kind of mixed, but one of the main ones you may have heard of for weight loss was a drug called Rumenabant. And this was a drug that attempted to block the CB1 receptor that the THC was interacting on. So if you've ever heard of people, having high amounts of THC and getting the munchies, or they feel like they're super hungry, that is a real documented effect. And how that happens is that as one of the side effects, or maybe the primary effect, of interaction with the CB1 receptor. So THC goes in, binds to the CB1 receptor, and one of the downstream things of that is appetite regulation. Now, some other data to show it might be a little bit more complicated than that, but the pharmaceutical companies then saw that, and they went, ooh, we have a good idea. If we can have the reverse effect of that, we may have a drug that can try to reduce appetite. And they did develop that drug, as I just mentioned the name. The unfortunate part was it was beneficial for appetite. So it's actually blocking that receptor. So instead of having the munchies, you're blocking the receptor. So you're going to have the opposite effect. So if we use our nightclub analogy again, imagine that you have a bouncer that's at the door that doesn't let you enter the nightclub. So therefore, the receptor is not getting activated. The downside with the drug is that it had some other side effects that did not allow it for approval, at least in the US. Because remember that the drug wasn't specific enough to block those receptors only in the brain. It appeared to be having effects on those receptors throughout the rest of the body, and that's what probably precipitated the side effects. They may be able to isolate these drugs in the future to have more specific effects per a local tissue. So it is true, THC does definitely increase appetite, and some of the other subcomponents, such as these terpenes, appear to have other physiologic effects also. If we take another step down and we look at the different delivery mechanisms, these do affect the compounds in and of themselves and do affect the actual physiologic effect you get at the end. Most people have probably heard of either an inhaled type agent, so either a vaping or burning directly as a joint, or there's even dry herb vaporizers now. And then you have an oral ingestion, such as an edible or an oil or a tincture. If you get bored and you're at a place and people are using cannabis, you can ask them about what was their first time using an edible. And most of the time the story goes, I don't know, I took some, nothing happened. I took more, and then, it all hit me all at once. So when you consume something as an edible, it has to enter the bloodstream via digestion and then actually gets converted to a compound called 11-hydroxy in the liver. So if you remember back to when we started, we said THC has mainly a component called delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. When you consume that, the liver converts it to a subcomponent called the 11-hydroxy version. So it is a little bit different drug actually in your body. And that process can be really variable from one person to the next. If you look at the literature, anywhere from 30, potentially maybe even 2 hours, it can be changed from digestion, what you ate, even maybe person to person. And the other part is that the curve, if you look at the absorption of it, isn't this nice linear curve. It's pretty flat and then gets extremely exponential. So it feels like, oh, nothing's happening to, oh, that was like way too much, right? And that seems to happen over a very short period of time. So if you are using different oral or edibles, keep in mind that they can be quite delayed. Obviously, dosing is going to matter too. So like normal, start low, and then you can kind of scale up a little bit from there. If you're not sure, probably wait longer than you think you would need to wait. With inhaled agents themselves, you're actually getting the delta-9 component into the lungs. Because the lungs have such a huge blood supply right next to them, the effects are happen within a really short period of time. This again can be a pro or con depending on how you look at it. The pro is that you'll notice the effect sooner, and then it's going to taper off much sooner. Edibles, can last much longer, and they have a very, very slow onset. Interesting side note is that if you were just to orally consume raw cannabis leaves for whatever reason, it actually doesn't have much of any effect. So they have to go through a process which is called decarboxylation, which could be from pressure or heat, and that converts the components in the actual cannabis to the active component that is having the physiologic effects in your body. So if you're using, like say, a joint, when you light it and you vaporize it, you're applying a high temperature, and then they get converted. So when they're making something like an edible, there's different ways of doing this conversion ahead of time, which is why they're a little bit different. So decarboxylation is a main method that you get the active components actually into the body. Other side note, when you're using an inhaled agent, it could be vaping via an oil, it could be vaping the dry herb itself, or like I said, burning a joint, those types of things. They all have slightly different profiles, but in general, they're going to be much faster. Another side note too, if you have, let's say, the raw material, so the cannabis itself that has a high amount of THC and CBD, but you want to try to change the ratio to see, could I get more CBD actually out of it? So on fancy vaporizers, you can change the temperature at which you vaporize it at. And unfortunately, the temperature for vaporization of THC and CBD is really, really close to each other. However, the terpene components, most of them will come off at a lower temperature when you vape them. So if you wanted to try to preferentially get more of the terpene components, you could start a vaporization at a much lower level, and then you would have more of the terpene components, you would have less of the THC and the CBD. So that might be one way if you want to get down in the weeds and play around with stuff, you can do that. Obviously, the starting material you have is going to make a big difference. If you want something that has more CBD, you'd have to look for strains and mixes that have more CBD in it. Last component there too, if you want to get really crazy, you can buy like hemp now that has primarily CBD and very low amounts of THC. So I do know some people that may use a high percentage of THC and then they may blend it with super high amount of CBD from like a hemp flower. Growers are trying to get a little bit better and more mixtures now, but a lot of the THC components tend to be very, very high. One of the reasons for this is that before it was legal, the goal was to try to breed the plants to have the highest amount of THC. If it was a black market, the hypothesis goes that, well, I'm going to be busted if I get busted for a certain number of weight, but I can sell a product that has a higher percentage of THC for more than a product that has a lower percentage of THC. So there's a lot of market pressure driven for the higher percentages of THC, which have gone up exponentially over the years. That's kind of reversing a little bit now, but just pay attention to the percentages that are in there, because that's going to make a huge difference on it. So as we summarize, your body has its own endocannabinoid system that it is using to regulate all components of your nervous system, metabolism, just really wide-ranging effects. It's been also called the master regulator. And I think of this as to more fine-tuning current existing systems to a little bit greater degree. Your body does produce its own endogenous cannabinoids. Those would be anandamide and 2-AG are the main ones. However, the cannabis plant does interact with those endogenous receptors. So these would be components in the cannabis itself. The primary ones are going to be THC and CBD, but there are also a whole bunch of other cannabinoids that, again, may serve to have more specific effects as we learn more. For example, CBN, possibly for sleep, and other components. The cannabis plant also has the terpenes. These are kind of the ones that smell, give it its aroma and some of its flavor. They do appear to have physiologic effects also. And so when you combine all these together, you get something called an entourage effect, and that the sum may be more than the parts. And so in the future, they're looking at having an actual chemical breakdown, what's called a chemovar sheet, showing you all the different components in it. And hopefully in the future, we'll have a better idea of how each one of these components interact with your physiology itself. So cannabis may serve as a tool that you can use to activate your own endocannabinoid system and enjoy and go from there. Thank you.
You'll notice how unhelpful the is it good or is it bad, you should never use it, you should always use it is, because it doesn't do justice to the complexity and the diversity of what this plant really can be.